Okay, well, first I'll just announcements. We also have student seminar this week on Friday. And okay, today, Andrea Pain, who is assistant professor at Horn Point, is going to be talking. Andrea did her undergrad at Wesleyan University. She got her master's at ETH in Switzerland in environmental science, and she did her PhD and postdoc at the University of Florida. And go for it.
Good. Cool. All right, let's go to full screen. Can you see my pointer? Just
Looks great.
Right, so today I'm going to be talking about some of the work I've been doing over the past few years, looking at the impacts of continental ice retreat on carbon and nutrient fluxes from land to air and sea. You'll notice I stuck air and in there from the previous title that I sent out, because I will be talking a little bit about greenhouse gas dynamics. And I'm going to be looking at continental ice retreat through the lens of what's going on in Greenland. So if you caught my talk at Appalachian Lab last fall, this will actually be a little bit different, so hopefully it won't be too repetitive for you. But I'm starting with the premise, oops, moving my Zoom people here. Starting with the premise that a lot of people are well aware of here, and that is that terrestrial inputs are really critical for coastal processes. So terrestrial freshwater input drives processes like circulation, delivers nutrients, which drives things like primary productivity and influences ecosystem composition. It also impacts the metabolism of coastal areas by driving atmospheric CO2 exchange. So we can think of some of these processes in terms of this equation here that's really simplified, where CO2 and nutrients, including nitrogen and phosphorus, are converted back into organic matter. And the reverse of this process delivers CO2 and inorganic nutrients. So I'll be talking a little bit about all of these components in the talk today and how they're delivered from deglaciating landscapes to the coast and how we can use Greenland to understand what those changes may look like in the future. Oops. So the Arctic is a particularly important place to look at some of these processes. It comprises about 1% of global ocean volume, but it receives about 10% of freshwater input from rivers. So changes in the composition, not only the volume of water flowing, but also the composition of this water could have really important impacts on carbon and nutrient dynamics on a global scale. So one of the kind of underlying questions that I'm going to try to answer today is, how will Arctic warming impact the export of terrestrial material from land to sea? So we think about some of the big changes occurring in the Arctic right now. One of them is that the Greenland Ice Sheet is melting. So this graphic here shows some of the changes that have been occurring over the past few decades in Greenland. This black line here represents the mass of Greenland in ice. You can see it's clearly decreasing over time. This is reflected in an increase in the meltwater delivery from Greenland to the ocean. And it's also corresponding with an increase in global sea level rise. So these changes are due largely to disproportionate Arctic warming that's occurring about 4 times the global average. The impacts of this warming are not only a delivery or increase or a decrease in the mass of the Greenland ice sheet, but an increase in the fluxes of water from land to sea in the Arctic. So about 0.5 millimeter of sea level rise per year can be directly attributed to the Greenland ice sheet. And this leads to changes in the delivery of glacial meltwater, as well as the solutes to coastal systems. And another kind of interesting part of this graphic is these gray bars here that show the increasing number of publications per year about Greenland. And a lot of these studies are focused on kind of constraining current meltwater and chemical fluxes from Greenland. But what I'm going to argue is that this is only really one side of the coin. If we look at what's been going on in the Arctic over the last 25,000 years or so, we see that the Arctic has been undergoing deglaciation for quite a while. So this is a representation of what the Northern Hemisphere looked like during the last glacial maximum about 25,000 years ago. So continental ice sheets covered a lot of North America and Eurasia. And warming led to the loss of most of this continental ice, with the last remaining portion in the Northern Hemisphere being the Greenland ice sheet. So along with this change, this resulted in about 130 meters of sea level rise. But importantly, it also resulted in the exposure of all these different new landscapes that have the capacity to deliver water and solutes to the ocean, but are governed by really distinct biogeochemical processes that could influence the quantity and quality of this water. So this change represents not only a change in the ice storage, but also how material is stored and moves through the landscape. So I'll be looking at the modern deglaciating landscape of Greenland to look at how biogeochemical fluxes from land to sea could have operated in the past and may operate in the future. So Greenland presents kind of an interesting place to look at some of these processes because it is currently deglaciating. So the Greenland ice sheet has been retreating for about 12,000 years and has led to the exposure of about 200 kilometers of previously glaciated area that is now exposed to the atmosphere and is undergoing things like soil development and ecosystem succession. A really important feature of this landscape is that the underlying material originated as glacial sediments. And so if we look at processes across this landscape, kind of one of the main variables that we would expect to lead to changes in the composition of water would be the amount of time the landscape's been exposed and how the processes of deglaciation have led to the formation of different ecosystems and organic material. So in part one of this talk, I'll be looking at kind of the first step of deglaciation, which is what happens when the ice actually melts. And so I'll be looking at some glaciated watersheds, which drain to what I'll call glacial meltwater rivers. And in these watersheds, the water is mainly derived from things like ice melt and some local precipitation. The second part of the talk, I'll be comparing these glacial watersheds to the regions that have been exposed for up to 12,000 years. And these are, I'll call these deglaciated watersheds, and they drain to non-glacial streams. So in contrast to the glaciated watersheds, the water is predominantly from local precipitation, active layer melt, which is basically another term for groundwater, as well as any permafrost contributions. So before I kind of get into the data and showing the study sites, I just wanted to show some photos of what these landscapes actually look like. So you can get a sense of how different they actually are. So on the left, I'm showing a proglacial watershed, which has been exposed for about 500 years or less. You can see the landscape is mainly a lot of rocks and sediment, very little kind of green things growing around. And compare this to the right picture of a deglaciated watershed that has been exposed for about 10.6 thousand years. So this amount of time has led to the development of organic rich soils and diverse terrestrial ecosystems. And so just visually, you might be able to make some hypotheses about how biogeochemical processes vary between these two landscapes. And that'll kind of be the main objective of my talk today is looking at some of these changes. So the first part of the talk, I'll be going over some data that was recently published in 2021, looking at how carbon dynamics may evolve with continued ice retreat. So I'm going to kind of go back on what I said in the previous slide, where glacial environments were mostly rock and water with little life. And I'm going to present some data that sort of suggests that there's more biological activity than potentially previously thought going on under the Greenland ice sheet that could impact carbon dynamics as the ice continues to retreat. So this picture on the left here shows a synthesis of ice core data that was taken in a few different studies. And the more that we know about what's underneath the Greenland ice sheet, the more it seems that there is a significant reservoir of organic material that would be available to participate in remineralization reactions and impact the carbon dynamics of that glacial meltwater. So organic matter remineralization can be represented in many different ways. Here are some simplified reactions where an organic molecule is converted into CO2. Under anaerobic conditions, you may also expect methanogenesis of an organic molecule resulting in the production of both CO2 and methane. So along with this information suggesting that there's actually organic material under the Greenland ice sheet, studies of outlet glaciers of the Greenland ice sheet have also observed information that suggests that there's life going on under the Greenland ice sheet. And so this is in the form of identifying active methane cycling microbes, observations of methane supersaturation under multiple glaciers, and the evidence of overridden subglacial permafrost. So essentially the mechanism that would provide this organic substrate is that when the ice sheet was smaller, terrestrial ecosystems and soils were developing. And as the ice sheet grew, it essentially overrode those deposits and led to the formation of these organic rich material that can then participate in these remineralization reactions. Oops. Another factor we need to think about when we're talking about glacial environments, however, is the dynamics of inorganic reactions. So glaciers produce a lot of fine-grained sediment due to physical erosion mechanisms under the glaciers. And these mineral surfaces have a really high capacity to participate in mineral weathering reactions. So the typical thought, or the classical view of these glacial systems is that all of these mineral weathering reactions result in the consumption of CO2. So subglacial environments are known to have a lot of these mineral weathering reactions occurring. The reactions are important in regulating atmospheric CO2 over geologic timescales, not just in glacial environments, but more broadly than that. But it's led some to present the hypothesis that proglacial rivers or glacial meltwater rivers are an under-recognized CO2 sink. And so given this information that we know that there's some methanogenesis going on under the Greenland ice sheet and this remineralization of these organic rich deposits, combined with this notion that CO2 is actually consumed by reactions under the Greenland ice sheet, it leads to this question of how do subglacial processes of the Greenland ice sheet actually impact greenhouse gas fluxes from water to the atmosphere. So I'm going to be showing data from 3 different glacial outlet sites. 2 of them are in the southwest of Greenland, and they drain to the Watson River. This is one of the largest and best studied glacial meltwater rivers of the Greenland ice sheet. So I'll present data from 2 different sites here. The first is called Issunguada, which I'll just refer to as the permafrost site because this is very near to where some subglacial permafrost has already been identified. And then I'll show also data from a location a little bit downstream called the Russell Glacier, which is actually the picture on my title slide. I'll compare this to a 3rd site in the south of Greenland called Kjaktut-Sermiat. For the sake of not really pronouncing that well, I'll just refer to this as the southern site. So essentially what we did is we collected samples as close to the glaciers as we could get during the spring and fall of 2017 and the summer of 2018. We used headspace extraction techniques to measure the dissolved concentration of CO2 and methane, as well as the stable isotopes of those gases, which will give us an indication of the gas concentration and potentially its origin. We also collected water samples and measured water chemistry. And the primary results I'll show from the water chemistry relates to a mass balance model that allows us to estimate the amount of mineral weathering occurring under the Greenland ice sheet. So the first data, the headspace extraction data, we see that there's a significant difference between sites in the amount of dissolved methane and CO2 in the subglacial outlet waters. So this first panel here is showing methane concentrations where the permafrost site, note the log scale here, the permafrost site is consistently supersaturated with respect to atmospheric concentrations over the entire melt season that we observed. The downstream site that also drains to the Watson River is also supersaturated with respect to methane, but at significantly lower concentrations, whereas the 3rd site has some elevated concentrations, but hovers much closer to atmospheric equilibrium. If we look at CO2, on the other hand, we see a little bit of a different story. We still see some significant differences between sites. So the permafrost site, where all the methane is found, also has supersaturated CO2 concentrations above atmospheric equilibrium. However, the Russell site is much closer to equilibrium with the atmosphere than this permafrost site. And the southern site is actually consistently undersaturated with respect to atmospheric concentrations. So this variation suggests a few different things. It suggests that the magnitude of remineralization could be very different between these sites. With just based on the concentration alone, we would suspect that the highest impact is at this permafrost site, where we see the elevated methane and CO2 concentrations. However, CO2 is both supersaturated, more or less at equilibrium, and undersaturated. And so this kind of begs the question of, what other processes are going on that could impact CO2 concentrations, and what is the role of mineral weathering processes? So if we talk about mineral weathering, we need to kind of divide the story into four different types of reactions that are occurring. So both carbonate minerals and silicate minerals can be weathered. And there's two different acids that predominantly do this weathering, carbonic acid and sulfuric acid. And depending on the mineral that's being weathered and the acid that is being used to weather that mineral, we have very different impacts on CO2. So I've written these reactions here below. So carbonate minerals, when they are weathered by carbonic acid, this is a sink of CO2. So this consumes atmospheric CO2. However, if these carbonate minerals are weathered by sulfuric acid, it's actually a CO2 source. If we look at the silicate minerals, carbonic acid weathering is a strong CO2 sink, so it consumes twice the amount of CO2 per mole of reaction, whereas sulfuric acid weathering of silicate minerals actually has no impact on CO2. And so we can look at the differences between these different mineral weathering reactions and try to understand how the net impact of mineral weathering reactions impacts CO2 under the Greenland ice sheet. So just a word about the amount of reaction we would expect from these two different mineral types. Carbonate minerals are present in trace amounts under the Greenland ice sheet. However, they have a very high solubility and rapid kinetics of dissolution. Therefore, they tend to have a disproportionate impact on the solute load. Whereas silicate minerals are present in higher abundances, but have a range of solubilities and typically slower kinetics than carbonate weathering. So thinking about what drives these reactions, we need to know something about the minerals that are there and also the sources of acids that drive this reaction. So sulfuric acid production is largely a product of pyrite oxidation in the subglacial environment, whereas carbonic acid has multiple sources, the important ones being atmospheric CO2 that can be delivered through cracks or fractures, as well as any gas bubbles in the ice itself, as well as organic matter remineralization produces CO2, which forms carbonic acid. So I'm going to try to parse apart how much of each of these reactions is occurring in order to understand what the net impact of mineral weathering is on subglacial CO2 concentrations and determine whether some of the variability that we see in the measured concentrations of CO2 could be a result of mineral weathering. And so to do this, we essentially measured the products of these mineral weathering reactions, including the major cations and anions, and performed a chemical mass balance model using these concentrations in order to solve for the amount of each reaction that's occurring in our subglacial water samples. So just kind of cutting to the punch here, just reminding you that these different reactions have different impacts on CO2. So this carbonate weathering with sulfuric acid is a CO2 source, whereas the carbonic acid weathering of carbonates and silicates are CO2 sinks. If we estimate the amount of each reaction that's occurring and sum them, essentially we see that the amount of mineral weathering or the mineral weathering that's occurring across our three sites consistently leads to uptake of CO2. So these are, the axes here are negative, suggesting that or indicating that mineral weathering was a net sink of CO2 in these sites. And some of the differences that we can see between sites have to do with the amount of each individual reaction that's contributing to the mineral weathering signature. But I really want to highlight here is that between sites, we have some consistencies, whereas we didn't have a lot of consistency in the measured CO2 and methane concentrations. So we see that CO2 is consistently sequestered by mineral weathering in these sites. We also see that there's a fairly similar range of CO2 that's taken up by mineral weathering. So we tend to be absorbing between 150 to, let's say, 50 micromoles of CO2 per liter of water. So what this suggests is that subglacial organic matter remineralization results in some CO2 supersaturation, and that's despite mineral weathering. So particularly at this permafrost site, even though mineral weathering is occurring and consuming CO2, we have enough organic matter remineralization occurring that we still measure supersaturated CO2 when that water eventually discharges from the glacier. And so what we can kind of take from this is that variations in CO2 concentrations of the glacial meltwater more likely result from variations in subglacial organic matter remineralization than they do from variations in mineral weathering. So just kind of some first summary and implications of this. Based on this information, it seems that organic matter remineralization is a heterogeneously important process under the Greenland ice sheet. So we see both water coming out that is a source of these gases to the atmosphere, but we also see that they, depending on the amount of organic matter remineralization, the glacial meltwater can actually be a sink of CO2. We suspect that some of this heterogeneity relates to the location of these subglacial organic matter deposits. So if we think about what's going to happen in the future as the ice continues to melt, the presence of all this organic matter suggests that the subglacial organic matter reservoirs could impact exports of biogeochemical materials downstream to downstream ecosystems and coastal zones, would suggest that the retreat of the Greenland ice sheet has significant implications for both downstream carbon and nutrient cycling. So now that we've looked at kind of what's happening with the Greenland ice sheet itself, we're going to kind of zoom out a little bit and look at how biogeochemical fluxes of material vary across this deglaciated landscape in order to sort of predict, what's going to happen as the ice continues to melt and these landscapes continue to develop. So I'm going to show you information from the same sites that I showed you gas information from at the outlet of the Watson River here. And Kiatut-Sermiat in the southern Greenland. And I'll be comparing the glacial meltwater river compositions and fluxes to deglaciated watersheds that span a range of exposure ages. So we have here a landscape that's been exposed for about 7,000 years. And at the coast, I'll show some information from landscapes that have been exposed for about 12,000 years. Similarly, in the south, we'll be looking at some deglaciated watersheds that are more recently deglaciated, as well as one that's been exposed for about 10.6 thousand years. So to evaluate the export of material, I'll show information that shows some discharge information from all of these systems, as well as show some chemical information so we can estimate the total export of material. So the first thing we need to do in order to think about how these landscapes are contributing water and solutes to the coast is to actually estimate how much water is flowing through these systems. So here I'm showing hydrographs or discharge over time from the glacial Watson River on the left here, compared to two non-glacial streams in the southwest transect. And sort of the main point I want to make showing this is that the Watson River is flowing at about, several orders of magnitude, more water flowing from the Watson River than any of these individual non-glacial streams. The non-glacial streams were actually data collected by us. So we installed some sensors over these years and did stream gauging, whereas the glacial meltwater river was collected by the Program for the Monitoring of the Greenland Ice Sheet, because it's a very tricky place to get discharges. The amount of water makes it a challenging place to work. So the amount of water flowing from each of these individual systems is quite different. However, if we think about watershed processes, we need to also factor into account the area that each of these systems are draining in order to understand per meter squared of land, how much water and what material is being delivered from these landscapes. So to do this, we calculated specific discharge of these different watersheds. So essentially, this is taking the total discharge over the year, dividing by the watershed area to give you a normalized water flow per unit area. So if we take a look at the specific discharge of these different watersheds, we see that despite the orders of magnitude difference in the amount of water flowing, the specific discharges are actually quite similar. They're within the same order of magnitude. I want to highlight here that the Watson River watershed has a lot of uncertainty in terms of estimating its total watershed area. And this has to do with numerous complications in looking at the subglacial topography, as well as defining the area that contribute to one particular glacial outlet. So despite this uncertainty, the order of magnitude of specific discharge is relatively similar between streams. So the fact that we have similar specific discharge between streams suggests that future fluxes, or as the ice continues to retreat, that future fluxes will depend more on the concentrations of solutes than on the actual amount of water flowing through these systems. So I'm going to show some estimates of material export from these different types of stream systems. And just a quick word about what how these estimates are made. Essentially what we did is we went out on various days and collected water samples and coupled them to the hydrograph or the discharge amount. So essentially by multiplying discharge and volume per time by concentration and mass per volume, we can estimate an instantaneous solute export in mass per time. So I'm going to show you some nutrient exports. I just want to say a quick word. When the relationship between concentration and discharge can be well constrained, you could actually extrapolate over this whole hydrograph. However, when there's a weak relationship, or for the nutrients that I'll show, there's a fairly weak relationship. So we need to know more about how the concentration of these nutrients varies over time. So I will be showing just the instantaneous solute export in mass per time. So these box plots are showing the combination of all the different glacial sites and the non-glacial sites that we visited over 2017 and 2018. And just showing the concentration of dissolved inorganic nitrogen, so nitrate plus ammonium, and phosphate. And so we see that even kind of in this broad brush approach, just looking at the distribution of concentrations, we see that the glacial system has significantly greater concentrations of both dissolved inorganic nitrogen and phosphate than the non-glacial systems. And when we couple this to the discharge information to calculate the instantaneous exports, we again see a significant difference between the watershed types. So there's two different estimates for the glacial exports, and that's based on the large uncertainty in the watershed area of the glacial meltwater river. But we see that even when this uncertainty is factored into account, the glacial systems are exporting significantly more nitrogen and phosphorus than the non-glacial systems. So it suggests that the sources and the cycling of these nutrients is significantly different between these two different types of landscapes. So when you take it one step further and take a look at the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus that's being exported, again, we see some significant differences. So the glacial meltwater river is exporting nitrogen to phosphorus in a ratio that's fairly similar to the Redfield ratio. So that would be what kind of phytoplankton would preferably take up in the coastal ocean. Whereas the non-glacial system have much more variable and typically higher nitrogen to phosphorus ratios. So they're exporting relatively more nitrogen relative to phosphorus. So this suggests that the retreat of continental ice sheets would lead to a change in the amount of nutrients that are exported, as well as the ratio of nutrients that are exported. So this could have impacts on things like nutrient limitation and ecosystem composition in the coastal ocean, the amount and type of primary productivity, and carbon dynamics. So kind of for the final piece of this talk, I'll be showing some newer data, some unpublished data, trying to understand where is all the phosphorus in these deglaciated watersheds? If it's not being exported, where is it? So one hypothesis that we could develop in terms of the phosphorus has to do with how we expect inorganic phosphorus and organic phosphorus reservoirs to evolve over time in a post-glacial landscape. So most phosphorus is originally present in the mineral form, which tends to be apatite. In a post-glacial landscape, mineral weathering results in the liberation of this phosphorus to phosphate. So this phosphate can either be exported in the streams, or it can be restored in other forms. So it can be uptaken by biota. It can also be absorbed to mineral phases, particularly iron oxides, that tend to form during soil development. So these are relatively bioavailable forms and increase with soil development. So one hypothesis that we wanted to test was, do we see differences in the amount of phosphorus stored in these different forms in a glacial versus a post-glacial or deglaciated landscape? So what we might expect is that over time, as this mineral phosphorus is weathered out, we would expect to see decreases in the amount of mineral phosphorus in sediments and soils. As these storage mechanisms evolve over time, we would expect the amount of phosphorus export to decrease, but the amount of bioavailable phosphorus stored in the landscape to increase. So to test this hypothesis, we collected some stream sediments and did a simple leaching experiment to characterize some of this inorganic phosphorus. So this leaching, I'll be talking just about the inorganic fractions today, but it started with a simple ion exchange reaction to remove labile or exchangeable phosphorus. We think of this as a highly labile type of phosphorus, so it's very easily taken up by biota. The second fraction is removing this iron or aluminum bound phosphorus, which we think of as having a relatively moderate lability. And finally, quantifying the amount of mineral phosphorus, which we think of as having kind of the lower amount, a lower lability. So the hypotheses that we kind of had going into this were that mineral phosphorus content would be lower in deglaciated compared to glaciated watersheds due to the impact of weathering over time, and that iron-bound phosphorus would be greater in deglaciated watersheds as those iron oxides have the chance to form over time and sequester some of the phosphorus. Both of those hypotheses could result in lower riverine phosphorus fluxes in the deglaciated systems compared to a glaciated system, which we observed in the previous section. So I'm showing first the mineral phosphorus reservoirs in the different deglaciated watersheds in orange compared to the glaciated watershed. So these are the southwest sites, and this is a southern site. So we see that there's really no significant difference between the glaciated and the non-glaciated stream sediments in terms of the mineral phosphorus content. So this is a bit counter to the hypothesis. But the explanation for this could be that the exposure age, so about 10,000 years, compared to weathering rates, would be insufficient to really deplete those reservoirs. So you would expect this process to take a bit longer than the exposure ages that we observe in our watersheds. If we look at the more labile forms, however, we see somewhat of a different story. So the labile or exchangeable phosphorus, we see that the glacial systems have significantly greater amounts of this labile phosphorus in both the southwest and the southern sites compared to any of the deglaciated watersheds. And the iron-bound fraction we see is significantly higher in the deglaciated watersheds compared to the glaciated watersheds. I just want to point out the difference in scale here. So this is going up to about 1 microgram of phosphorus per gram of sediment, whereas this one goes up to 80. So overall, we have much more iron-bound phosphorus than this labile form. However, the dominant reservoir, or the magnitude of these reservoirs, significantly differs between the glacial and the non-glacial sites in both cases. So some of the explanations for these trends could be that the labile exchangeable phosphorus is present on these, the high amount of glacial flour present in these proglacial streams could have a higher capacity to absorb phosphorus in these loosely exchangeable, loosely sorbed forms. Another hypothesis would be that the aquatic vegetation in non-glacial rivers could deplete this reservoir. However, if we think about the iron-bound phosphorus, our hypothesis seems to be supported that iron oxide formation in a post-glacial environment leads to the sequestering of this phosphate. And the combination of these two changes would result in a higher export from a glacial environment and a higher terrestrial storage in a deglaciated environment, which would result in lower exports of phosphate in streams. So we kind of sum up those two kind of the shift in reservoirs. We think that deglaciation results in a reduction of this labile exchangeable phosphorus at the expense of these iron-bound phosphorus formations. And so kind of the key takeaway from this analysis is that shifts in the storage of phosphorus across the landscape could result in shifts of the ratio of phosphorus exported compared to that which is stored on the landscape. So a summary of the data is that greenhouse gas fluxes from the Greenland ice sheet appear to be heterogeneous and could relate to the position and magnitude of these subglacial organic carbon deposits. The assessment of the nutrient exports between the glacial and the deglaciated watersheds suggests that the export and NDP ratios will decrease with deglaciation, and by that I mean as the relative export from each watershed type changes, and could result from changing land-water interactions, a key factor of which is the formation of those iron oxides to absorb the phosphorus. These observations suggest that changes in the biogeochemical processes across these deglaciating landscapes could drive variation in coastal Arctic biogeochemical cycles and net metabolism over glacial interglacial periods. So I think we have time. I just want to spend a few minutes talking about some current and future work that stems from some of this work that I presented today. So in summer of 2022, I'll be going out to Greenland again, hopefully, if the pandemic allows it, to kind of look at the land-water interactions across these deglaciating landscapes. So I mentioned that the iron oxide formation has strong implications for the storage of phosphorus, but also has implications for storage of a lot of other materials that like to absorb to those mineral phases. So the goal will be to go up into the soils where these land-water interactions are really occurring to characterize how the formation of iron oxide minerals impact the storage of both phosphorus and organic material from soils to streams. A second research area is looking at how subsurface hydrology impacts the transport of material from soils to streams. So if we look at this diagram here, carbon moves through permafrost impacted landscapes in many different ways. One of the least well understood ways is how it moves through the subsurface where it can eventually be exported in streams. So along with the kind of the deglaciation transect that I showed you today, there's also a gradient in permafrost and hydroclimatic conditions across this gradient. So in the more ice adjacent regions, we tend to have continuous permafrost coverage and relatively low annual precipitation. And that's compared to the coastal watersheds that are have a discontinuous permafrost and tend to have higher annual precipitation. So we'll be looking at how the hydrologic conditions across this transect impact the transport of material from soils to streams, and then ultimately to the coastal ecosystems. One last little area I wanted to mention is looking at how these transport of material actually impacts offshore dynamics. And this is my student, Nicole Trenholm, is really spearheading this effort, looking at how freshwater delivery dynamics between marine terminating glaciers, land retreated glaciers, and deglaciated fjords impact fjord biogeochemical processes and carbon burial. So she'll be going out in this summer to look at Southwest Greenland fjords, and doing some assessments on tidal and seasonal sampling frequencies to understand how freshwater delivery and the composition of water impacts offshore biogeochemical processes. So I just said a couple words about that, but Nicole will talk much more in detail on during her presentation on Friday. So I would recommend everybody tune into that. So that concludes my talk today. I would like to acknowledge NSF, as well as the many, many people that contributed to this work. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions.
So people can either put questions into the chat or raise your hands. Andrea, it looks like you have some questions in the chat already, if you want to look at them.
Great. Okay, so Hallie's asking, have you considered the potential for carbonate alkalinity and buffering stream pH might interact with phosphorus speciation and bioavailability? So that's actually something we haven't quite looked at yet. The work on the phosphorus has really been looking at the sediment compositions and the soil phosphorus reservoirs. So a little bit less in the stream itself. But I think that would be a really valuable direction to look. And the second question, how these observations relate to Alaskan glacier melting dynamics on biogeochemical cycles and warming coastal changes in the Arctic. So I'm a little bit less familiar with the Alaskan stuff than with Greenland. However, I do know that there have been some really interesting studies coming out looking at how glacier, essentially how glacial coverage and watersheds impacts the export of organic carbon and nitrogen. And so I didn't present it in this talk here, but we actually did a similar sort of examination of organic carbon export between the glacial and the non-glacial streams, and found some similar results in that the deglaciated regions tend to be exporting more organic carbon that have that appear to be from distinct sources. So in the glacial sites, we tend to have more organic carbon from things like algae and microbes, whereas the deglaciated systems are more dominated by terrestrial vegetation and soils. So I think there are some really strong linkages that would be really valuable to look a little bit, to do a little bit of a cross-pollination between the Alaskan and Greenlandic researchers. And then Jeff asks, with iron being central to phosphorus balances, have there been any efforts to track export cycling of dissolved iron? So yes, that is another bit of data that I didn't present today. We have measured iron in these different systems, and we do see significant differences in the iron export. There tends to be much more iron exported from these glacial meltwater rivers. And again, we think it relates a lot to the abundance of this really fine-grained material, and the kind of all the iron-bearing minerals really contributing to that. Some other preliminary work on iron, we've been speciating the iron into dissolved and colloidal forms, and we see significant differences in the speciation of iron across the size continuum, where the glacial environments tend to have much more iron in the pure dissolved form, whereas the non-glacial environments, the iron tends to be associated more with colloids, And again, we think that relates to the organic matter differences between these watersheds, with the higher amount of organic matter leading to the formation of those colloids. So there's a lot more to do on iron, and a lot more I hope to do over the next few years, but the iron really appears to be kind of a master variable to explain some of the differences in stream exports. So that, yeah, that's really key.
Larry?
Hi, Andrea. This is really interesting. I have a question for you about, perhaps it's just, I hope it's not silly, but a question for you about the source of the fresh water.
Sure.
So is the melting occurring at the edge of the glacier? Is it occurring at the surface and then running down, or is it occurring at the bottom and then running out?
That's a very, very good question. It's really an important question in terms of understanding how the composition of the glacial meltwater changes over time. So the meltwater is from, the source actually changes throughout the melt season. So we tend to have in the early spring, a lot of meltwater that's kind of stored over the previous year in these little pockets of meltwater under the ice. So that water tends to be really enriched in solutes, since this kind of had a lot of time to sit there and react. As the glacier melts and essentially over the melt season, the drainage system becomes more and more efficient, so that essentially by the peak of the melt season, most of the meltwater is coming from the top and being siphoned down into these really efficient conduits. So you do see an important difference in the source of the meltwater between, say, the early and the peak melt season, which does impact the composition of that meltwater and has really important implications for what's being exported. So that's not silly at all. It's a very good question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You've got another one in the chat. Which no.
Does anyone else have questions for Andrea?
I do have one other question, which is, so when you showed the cross section of the glacier from north to south, essentially, the bedrock is greatly depressed in the center of the glacier, right?
Yes.
So does water run uphill because there's so much pressure above of the ice above it? In other words, is the pressure, horizontal pressure gradient from the middle of the glacier towards the edges everywhere, or is there actually a pooling of water in the center of the glacier because of the depression of the bedrock?
That's also a very good question. The water, the pressure gradients drive the water flow, but they don't necessarily so the way the water flows on the base of the glacier has to do with, right, the amount of ice and the amount of water flowing through these conduits. So you have this switch in the flow direction of the water throughout the melt season, as well as these conduits become more or less essentially full of water. So you have flow back into the kind of away from the conduits during periods of high flow, and then as the flow kind of subsides and there's less of a hydraulic pressure there, flow will continue to go into the conduits. I don't think I quite answered your question. That's actually an area that I'm not as familiar with. The subglacial environment is very mysterious. So there's a lot of people who are really trying to figure out how the water flows. It's a really important and a not well resolved question. And it also has really important implications for how the glacier moves, essentially, how the ice
Right.
moves. So those are really, there's kind of a lot of different schools of thought in terms of how the water is flowing under the glacier. I'm not entirely sure I can do that whole question justice, but it is quite complicated and still quite mysterious.
Yeah, I know. I've read a little bit about how it's essentially, they think it's lubricating the flow of the glacier itself, right?
Right, right. Yeah, but there are parts of the glacier that have liquid water underneath them, so they're called warm base, and there are parts of the glacier that have no liquid water, and then there are parts that experience both. And so it's really kind of a complicated hydrological system going on there, and it's rapidly evolving as well.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Jeff had unmuted himself, but now he's talking with his
Yeah,
mute on.
I have another question. I was thinking about, you're looking at weathering of materials after they've been delivered into different parts of these systems. But I was wondering if you had a sense of sort of the mass of materials or the accumulation rates, or where are the particles going? Where are they residing over time? Because if you pile them up fast, they might not interact very well with surface water processes and biogeochemistry.
Right.
Whereas, when accretion rates are really low, then those exchanges become paramount.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a lot of landforms that are created by this sediment. So the glaciers tend to have these really huge outwash plains of essentially sand and silt. And so you might think that the processes between the sediment and water may be relatively unimportant, but there's another important factor in that there's a lot of daily fluctuation in the water level of these glacial meltwater rivers. So essentially at peak, especially during the peak melt season, you have a lot of ice melt that causes the water level to rise, and then it falls again. And so essentially what that does is kind of pump water through these sediments. And so it's an additional mechanism to deliver some of these mineral weathering products to streams. So another aspect of this work that I'm hoping to look a little bit more in depth on is the impact of some of these hyporheic exchange processes, particularly in these glacial meltwater rivers where you have this huge variation over the course of a day. You have these huge variations in the hydraulic conditions. So that kind of amplifies the impact of all of these mineral weathering reactions. And so the answer of how much there actually is, I think we're just starting to get at that. We have the subglacial reactions occurring. We also have to think about the in-stream reactions, because it's about a 50-mile long river. So there's also a high capacity for in-stream reactions to be occurring, as well as additional sources or additional mineral weathering, again, from hyporheic exchange. So that's kind of the state of that question. Is there's still a lot of work to be done, but it's an important one for sure.
Well, it strikes me that there are decades worth of great research questions that you could march through
Exactly.
over time and you keep going after one
Right,
thing
right.
to another.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Let's say thank you to Andrea one more time, and thanks to everyone for coming.
Thank you so much for Jacob and Claire for organizing.
Thank you.